Less than 2 hours. That is how close the 50% tariffs actually came to hitting billions of dollars worth of Canadian goods before Donald Trump posted a message on Truth Social late Tuesday night, pausing the whole thing. He called it a deal. Prime Minister Mark Carney called it substantial progress, but did not use the word deal at all. Those two different descriptions, coming out within hours of each other, tell you almost everything you need to know about where this actually stands. In this script, we are laying out exactly what was announced, what both leaders actually said, what is still missing, and why the phrase, "how much is this deal actually worth?" is the right question to be asking right now, rather than treating this as a finished, settled outcome. Let's start with the exact sequence of events, because the timing here matters. Late Tuesday, August 18th, less than 2 hours before a 50% tariff was set to hit $20 billion worth of Canadian imports, Trump posted on Truth Social. His exact words were, "I have paused the 50% tariffs against Canada that were scheduled to kick in tomorrow morning for a 3-day period, based on the fact that Canada and the USAO, subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal." He then posted an AI-generated image of himself pulling the Keystone XL pipeline, the long-stalled cross-border oil project killed under the previous administration, out of a grave marked with a tombstone reading buried by Biden. His message also floated the idea that the Keystone XL pipeline may be awoken from the grave. That specific detail, the AI-generated image and the Keystone XL reference, is worth pausing on briefly, because it illustrates something about the tone of this announcement that matters for understanding how seriously to weigh it as a finished outcome. The Keystone XL pipeline has nothing directly to do with the alcohol, auto, and dairy issues that were the actual stated basis for this tariff dispute in the first place. Its inclusion appears to reflect Trump's broader messaging style, rather than representing an actual confirmed, negotiated element of this specific trade agreement. When an announcement mixes a genuinely significant policy update, the tariff pause itself, together with an unrelated symbolic flourish presented with equal enthusiasm, it becomes harder to separate what has actually been concretely agreed to from what is simply part of the broader presentation. The next morning, speaking to reporters at the White House during a tour of South Lawn construction, Trump elaborated further, describing the talks as producing a very fair deal for both sides. He said, "Our farmers are going to be thrilled. Our manufacturers are going to be thrilled." He specifically said American dairy farmers would benefit, stating our farmers will no longer be held up, because they were being hurt very badly by Canada. On the auto tariff question specifically, when asked directly whether the U.S. planned to drop any of the tariffs it charges on Canadian autos, Trump said, "We're reducing it a little bit," without specifying an actual number or percentage. Now, here is where the story gets more complicated, because Carney's own public response was noticeably different in tone and content. Carney released a statement Tuesday night that did not use the word deal at all and made no mention of the Keystone XL pipeline whatsoever. His actual statement read, "Over the last number of weeks, Canada has engaged in intensive discussions with the United States to address outstanding trade issues and deliver greater certainty and real benefits for Canadian businesses, workers, farmers, and families. Substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done." He added that Canada remains focused on building a stronger, more independent, and more competitive economy at home. That specific phrase, "important work still to be done," is doing a lot of quiet work in that statement. It is Carney's way of confirming that talks move forward, while explicitly avoiding calling this a finished, signed agreement, the way Trump had already framed it publicly. Carney's own government confirmed the practical outcome of these talks in more precise legal terms, stating that the United States has agreed to postpone implementation of its 50% tariff on a range of Canadian goods, imposed under Section 338 of the U.S. Tariff Act of 1930, until the end of day on August 21st. In other words, what actually happened on the record, in writing, from Canada's own government, is a 3-day delay tied to ongoing negotiations, not a finalized trade agreement. This contrast between the two leaders' public framing is worth dwelling on a little longer, because it reflects two governments managing two very different domestic audiences simultaneously. Trump's language, describing a deal in confident, celebratory terms, plays well to an American audience eager for a clear, decisive win to point to after a tense standoff. Carney's more careful, qualified language, acknowledging progress while explicitly flagging unfinished work, reflects the political reality he faces at home, where any suggestion of having caved too quickly or too fully to American pressure carries real domestic political risk, particularly given how closely Canadians on all sides of this dispute have been watching for signs of exactly that outcome throughout the preceding weeks. So what does this deal, tentative as it currently stands, actually appear to cover? According to a White House document shared Tuesday night, Canada expressed a commitment to tackle the issues the U.S. had originally flagged when it first announced these tariffs, specifically covering 3 areas: provincial bans on American alcohol, Canadian auto import quotas, and access for American dairy products into Canada's supply-managed dairy system. The executive declaration Trump signed to delay the tariffs stated that Canada had expressed a commitment to remove the discriminations or unreasonable and unequal impositions the U.S. had been citing throughout this dispute. It is worth pausing on the word choice there specifically, expressed a commitment. That is meaningfully different language from confirmed removal or agreed to eliminate. Expressing a commitment to address an issue is the language of an intention, a direction both sides say they are heading in, not necessarily proof that the underlying policies have actually already changed. This distinction is part of why so much coverage following the announcement carried headlines describing key terms as remaining unclear rather than describing a finished, fully specified agreement. This kind of intentionally vague, forward-looking language is actually fairly common in the early public announcement stage of major international trade agreements, well before the detailed legal text has been fully drafted and reviewed by lawyers on both sides. Governments often want to announce progress publicly, particularly under deadline pressure, like the one facing this specific 50% tariff, before every single implementation detail has been fully hammered out, since waiting for full legal precision could mean missing the window to avoid the tariff deadline altogether. The trade-off is that announcements made at this stage inevitably carry more uncertainty and more room for either side to later characterize specific details differently than initially implied, which is exactly the dynamic playing out here between Trump's confident deal framing and Carney's more cautious substantial progress language. Let's break down what we actually know and do not know about each of the three specific areas covered. On dairy, Trump described the outcome as great for our farmers, but the actual mechanics here are more nuanced than that framing suggests. Canada operates a supply management system for dairy, which includes tariff rate quotas, meaning a certain amount of foreign dairy can enter Canada at a lower tariff rate, with imports beyond that quota facing significantly higher tariffs. According to reporting following the announcement, American dairy producers do not currently export enough dairy product to Canada to even reach the existing quota threshold in the first place. That detail matters enormously because it means the practical, real-world impact of any dairy-related concession may end up being far smaller than the celebratory language coming out of the White House podium would suggest, at least in the near term, unless American producers significantly ramp up their actual export volume to Canada going forward. This dairy detail is worth sitting with a little longer, because it captures something important about how these kinds of trade announcements can sound significant without necessarily changing much in practice. If the existing quota already sits above what American producers are currently able to supply, then removing or loosening quota restrictions does not actually open up meaningfully more market access in the short term, since the constraint was never really the quota itself, but rather American producers' own current export capacity. Whether this changes over a longer time frame, as American dairy producers potentially scale up production specifically to serve the Canadian market now that quota concerns have been addressed, is a separate question that will only become clear well beyond the scope of this current 3-day pause. On autos, the picture is similarly underspecified. Trump confirmed the U.S. would be reducing tariffs on Canadian autos, but explicitly declined to give a specific number when asked directly by reporters, saying only we're reducing it a little bit. That is about as vague as an announcement can get while still technically confirming a change is coming. This vagueness has real consequences for people whose jobs depend on the actual number landing somewhere specific. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and a member of the federal government's group of insider trade advisors, spoke directly to this uncertainty. He told CTV News that whatever the final negotiated tariff rate ends up being, it has got to be below 6%, adding that for 60 years, the industry had been working at 0% tariffs on this specific trade. Volpe warned that if automakers are forced to absorb or pass on hundreds of millions of dollars in extra costs to consumers each year, manufacturing plants in places like Brampton or Woodstock, Ontario, could end up relocating to the U.S. or elsewhere, wherever operations end up being more profitable. He put the stakes in blunt terms, saying they, meaning the United States, are just shooting themselves in the foot if they're going to charge their own companies a penalty to sell to their own customers, a reference to how deeply integrated cross-border auto manufacturing supply chains actually are between the two countries. Volpe's position as a member of the federal government's own group of insider trade advisors gives his comments additional weight beyond that of an outside industry critic. He is someone with direct visibility into how these negotiations have actually been unfolding, which makes his specific numerical benchmark that any final rate needs to land below 6%, a genuinely useful marker for evaluating whatever final auto tariff figure eventually gets confirmed. If the final negotiated rate comes in above that threshold, based on Volpe's own stated math, the auto industry itself would likely characterize the deal as insufficient, regardless of how it gets framed publicly by either government. On alcohol, this is the one area where Canada has shown the clearest, most concrete willingness to move. Provincial bans on American alcohol have been in place in every Canadian province, except Alberta and Saskatchewan, since earlier in this trade dispute when provinces pulled American products off shelves as part of Canada's broader retaliatory response. Addressing this specific irritant appears to be the most straightforward of the three issues to resolve, since it involves reversing a policy decision Canadian provinces themselves made, rather than restructuring a long-standing domestic industry protection system the way dairy supply management or auto import quotas would require. Even with alcohol representing the more straightforward of the three issues, it is worth remembering that these bans were implemented at the provincial level, not by Canada's federal government directly. That means Carney's ability to actually deliver on this specific commitment depends partly on cooperation from individual provincial governments, choosing to reverse their own policies, rather than being something the federal government in Ottawa can simply unilaterally guarantee on its own. Given that Quebec's premier specifically said she had not yet seen the full terms of the deal as of Wednesday morning, it remains an open question exactly how, and how quickly, provinces would actually move to reverse these alcohol restrictions, even once the broader federal level agreement gets finalized. It is also worth understanding the broader context feeding into why this deal, even in its current unfinished form, matters so much economically. Nearly 72% of Canada's total goods exports last year went to the United States. That is an enormous share of Canada's overall economy tied to a single trading partner, which explains why avoiding the specific 50% tariff, even temporarily, represented such high stakes for Canada specifically. On the American side, there is a political dimension worth noting too. Analysts have pointed out that the Trump administration may have been wary of imposing a hefty new tariff, paid ultimately by U.S. importers who typically try to pass along added costs to consumers through higher prices, heading into November's midterm elections, especially with American voters already expressing frustration over the cost of living. That detail offers a plausible, non-Canada specific explanation for why the American side had its own incentive to find some kind of resolution, rather than simply letting the full 50% tariff take effect, as originally scheduled. This midterm election context deserves a bit more attention, since it offers a useful lens for understanding the timing of this specific pause. Tariffs of this scale are not abstract policy tools that exist in isolation from domestic politics. The costs of a 50% tariff on $20 billion of imports would, in practice, get absorbed somewhere along the supply chain, frequently landing at least partly on American consumers through higher prices at the register. With cost of living already a significant political concern heading into the midterms, avoiding an additional clearly attributable price shock in the weeks and months following implementation gives the administration a tangible incentive to seek some form of resolution, even a temporary one, rather than allowing the full tariff to take hold and potentially become a visible talking point for political opponents ahead of the election. Reactions from other officials involved paint a picture of a deal still very much in progress rather than finished business. Quebec Premier Christine Frechette was seen passing CTV news cameras on her way into the provincial legislature the morning after the announcement and told reporters she had not yet seen all the terms of Canada's agreement with the U.S. That detail is worth sitting with. A provincial premier, whose own province has been described elsewhere in this dispute as the most heavily impacted by the tariffs so far, had not been shown the actual terms of the deal her own federal government had just been credited with reaching. That is not typically how a finished, fully vetted trade agreement gets rolled out. It is far more consistent with a deal still being drafted, with details still being worked out, even as the initial announcement was already generating headlines. Frechette's specific concern about her province's exposure connects to comments made elsewhere describing Quebec as having lost thousands of jobs across multiple sectors due to the broader tariff dispute, with particular emphasis on the importance of preserving the dairy supply management mechanism for the province's agriculture sector specifically. That framing places Quebec's own priorities somewhat in tension with the dairy access commitments the federal government has reportedly made to the U.S. Since any meaningful loosening of dairy protections runs directly against what Quebec's own provincial government has publicly identified as a priority worth defending. This is yet another example of the layered, sometimes competing set of interests that any final version of this deal will need to navigate before it can genuinely be considered settled. Later on Wednesday, Carney's office confirmed the Prime Minister was meeting with his own cabinet and with Canada's provincial premiers, specifically to discuss the potential trade deal, a meeting scheduled for that same afternoon. The fact that this briefing needed to happen after the public announcement rather than before it reinforces the picture of an agreement whose actual substance was still being communicated internally within the Canadian government, even as it was already making international headlines. This sequencing, a public announcement first, followed by internal government briefing second, is worth flagging as somewhat unusual for a genuinely finalized international agreement. Typically, in a fully completed trade deal, the relevant domestic stakeholders, cabinet members, provincial leaders and affected industry representatives would have already been briefed on the actual terms before any public announcement went out, precisely to avoid the kind of scenario that played out here, where a provincial premier found out about a deal affecting her own province's industries primarily through media coverage rather than through direct communication from the federal government beforehand. That sequencing gap is itself a data point supporting the broader conclusion that this announcement represented a framework agreement made public under deadline pressure, rather than a fully vetted, internally coordinated final deal. CBC News reported directly that Canadian and U.S. negotiators were, as of Wednesday, working on the final text of an agreement that would avert new tariffs and smooth over what the outlet described as long-standing bilateral trade irritants. The phrase final text is doing important work there. It confirms this was not, as of the initial announcement, a completed, signed, ready-to-implement agreement. It was a framework, a direction both governments say they are heading toward, with the actual legal text still being drafted days after Trump's initial celebratory social media post. This gap between a public announcement and a fully drafted legal text is not unusual in high-stakes international negotiations generally, but it is worth naming clearly here specifically, because the initial framing of this story, both in Trump's own language and in some subsequent headlines, presented this as a completed deal rather than a framework still being finalized. Anyone following this story closely should watch specifically for confirmation of that final legal text being signed, rather than treating the initial Truth Social announcement itself as proof that every detail has been locked in and agreed to by both governments. It is also worth situating this specific moment within the much longer arc of this trade dispute, because that context helps explain both why this pause matters and why skepticism about how quickly it will actually resolve into something durable is reasonable. This trade war between the U.S. and Canada, and separately Mexico, began back on February 1st, 2025, when the United States first imposed tariffs on Canadian goods. Canada responded with its own retaliatory tariffs, matching American measures on steel, aluminum, and autos. Over the following 18 months, this relationship went through multiple rounds of escalation and partial de-escalation. Carney's government rolled back many of Canada's countermeasures earlier in 2025, though the auto quotas and the provincial alcohol bans, the same two issues central to this current announcement, remained in place as leverage heading into these latest negotiations. There have also been previous moments in the same relationship where optimistic-sounding announcements did not immediately translate into fully resolved outcomes. Back in July of 2025, Trump told reporters ahead of a trip to Scotland that he did not expect to reach a trade deal with Canada at all, saying, "We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada," and adding, "I think Canada could be one where there's just a tariff, not really a negotiation." That comment came the same week Carney had publicly stated Canada would not accept a bad deal and would not rush into an agreement simply to beat a deadline. The eventual outcome of that particular standoff was a 35% tariff that did, in fact, take effect on August 1st, 2025, layered on top of tariffs already in place, with the existing exemption for goods, compliant with the North American Trade Agreement between Canada, the U.S. And Mexico still holding at that specific point in the broader dispute. That history matters here because it shows this relationship has a documented pattern of dramatic public statements, whether optimistic or pessimistic, that do not always match how negotiations actually resolve in the following days and weeks. A president posting an enthusiastic Truth Social message describing a deal is not on its own proof that every detail has been worked out and locked in. Given that pattern, and given that Carney's own statement pointedly avoided using the word deal while Trump's message used it directly, treating this current announcement as fully finished business would be getting ahead of what the actual documented record currently supports. This trade relationship's broader history also includes moments where Carney himself used notably stark language to describe the stakes involved. Earlier in this dispute, following an earlier round of tariffs, Carney stated publicly that the system of global trade anchored on the United States, a system Canada had relied on since the end of the Second World War, was over, and that Canada's old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States was over as well. Language that direct, describing a fundamental shift in a decades-old economic relationship, reflects just how significant the stakes of this broader dispute have felt from Canada's perspective throughout its various stages, adding further context for why Carney's own government would be cautious about declaring premature victory on a deal whose legal text was, as of this announcement, still being finalized. So, bringing this together, what is this deal actually worth right now, as of what we know today? It bought 3 days. That is the single most concrete, verifiable outcome, a 50% tariff on $20 billion of Canadian goods, delayed from taking effect until the end of day on August 21st. Beyond that 3-day delay, the deal represents a stated direction rather than a finished outcome. Canada has expressed commitment to address the alcohol, dairy, and auto issues the U.S. originally cited. Progress on the alcohol issue appears most concrete. since it involves reversing an existing provincial policy rather than restructuring deeper economic systems. Progress on dairy is real on paper, but may carry limited practical impact, given that American producers reportedly do not currently export enough product to even reach existing quota thresholds. Progress on autos remains the least specified of the three, with Trump himself declining to name an actual percentage, and industry figures like Flavio Volpe already publicly stating what threshold the industry considers survivable, a number nobody in either government has yet confirmed matches what has actually been negotiated. The honest, currently verifiable answer to how much is this deal worth is that its most concrete value right now is the 3-day pause itself, plus a documented written commitment from Canada to keep working toward resolving 3 specific long-standing trade grievances. Everything beyond that, the actual auto tariff percentage, the practical dairy access terms, and the final legal text of whatever agreement eventually emerges, remained genuinely unresolved and unconfirmed as of the most recent statements from officials on both sides, including a provincial premier who had not yet even seen the terms of the deal her own country was being credited with reaching. That is the real documented picture here, based on Trump's own public statements, Carney's own written statement, the executive declaration Trump signed, on the record comments from Quebec's premier, and independent reporting on the substance of what has and has not actually been agreed to so far. Whatever happens between now and the end of day on August 21st, when this specific 3-day pause expires, will determine whether this becomes a genuinely resolved trade agreement or simply another chapter in a relationship that has already produced more than one premature declaration of resolution over the past 18 months. For anyone tracking the story closely, the single clearest marker to watch for is that final legal text CBC News described negotiators as still working on. Until that specific document is completed, signed, and made public, with an actual confirmed percentage attached to the auto tariff reduction and clear language on how dairy access and the provincial alcohol restrictions will actually be implemented, the most accurate description of where things stand remains exactly what Carney's own government stated in writing. Substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done. That is a genuinely meaningful outcome after 18 months of escalating tension. It is simply not yet the finished deal the initial headlines made it sound like,